Hello and welcome to another episode of Disastrous History. This episode is going to be one of those episodes that has likely been covered to death, but my ability to become hyper-focused on a single disaster won't let me move on before doing the episode. And since the 44th anniversary of this particular disaster was just a couple weeks ago, it became my hyper-focus. Plus, I already told my patrons what the episode would be, so we're going to have to do it now. This episode is going to cover the Mount Saint Helens eruption in 1980. Now, it has been a long time since we have had a volcanic eruption as an episode. I think it was 2021, which feels like a lifetime ago. But you know what that means. It's time for a full explanation of volcanoes. So first things first, what is a volcano? It is essentially a place where the Earth's crust is weakest and magma is able to eject out of the ground in various forms, be that lava, ash, gases, steam, whatever you have coming out. But let's get a little more technical than that. The quintessential image in everyone's mind of a volcano is the one you make in science class. It's a giant cone-shaped mountain with a crater in the top that you pour Dawn dish soap, vinegar, and baking soda into, and it erupts out the top, spewing foam everywhere and rushing all down the sides. A lot of volcanoes do indeed look like that, but only after many eruptions. You see, the volcano isn't the mountain part. The mountain part is the after of the volcano. The volcano is actually just the crack that allows magma to flow through. But how do we get a volcano to form is no doubt the question you are now asking. There are actually multiple ways to get a volcano. The first and most common, actually, is constructive plate boundary volcanoes. So this is a very specific type of volcano. This is where two tectonic plates are moving away from each other. Naturally, this gap in the tectonic plates creates a void space where magma can force its way in. Oh, and magma, by the way, is specifically molten rock below ground. It only becomes lava once that molten rock comes out of the ground and is now above the ground. So magma is below ground, lava is above ground. Now, the best example for this is Iceland. Iceland sits on the space between the Eurasian tectonic plate and the North American tectonic plate. Those two are currently pulling away from each other, and magma is rushing up to fill the gap, thus creating Iceland, the entire island as a whole, on the boundary which is called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The next most common type of volcano is called a destructive boundary volcano. There are two ways to get this type. Number one is an oceanic tectonic plate is shoved under another oceanic tectonic plate, or an oceanic tectonic plate is shoved beneath a continental tectonic plate. This process is called subduction. When the plate is shoved under the other plate, the part underneath begins to melt and shoves magma upwards towards the surface. An example of the ocean under continent is the Andes and volcanoes on the west coast of the United States. So, hint, hint, wink, wink, Mount Saint Helens. The last type of volcanoes is called hotspot volcanism. These are volcanoes that come up in the middle of tectonic plates where the crust has become weakened by the superheated mantle and magma is able to rise to the surface and begin erupting. The Hawaiian Islands as a whole are a great example of this. They lie in the middle of the Pacific Plate, however, the mantle below them is extremely weak and allows for all of the magma to rise up and form the Hawaiian island chain. Now, these are specifically how the magma gets to the surface and becomes lava. But then once that lava is on the surface, there are three types of volcanoes based on how they are structured, so how they look above the surface. Technically, there are more, but we're going with the main classics here. The first type is the stratovolcano. These are made by years and years and years of layer upon layer of slow-moving lava hardening and building up towards the sky. These are the quintessential image of a volcano. Mount Vesuvius, Mount Rainier, places like that. The next kind is called a shield volcano. These are also built up with years upon years upon years of lava flowing down them. But this lava is significantly more viscous, which allows it to travel significantly faster and makes the volcano stretch out long distances because it can travel significantly farther before cooling down. And basically it looks like a shield laying on the ground because it moves out and it's able to flatten significantly farther. The volcanoes in Hawaii are a great example of this. That lava is very fast flowing compared to other lavas, and it allows it to build that really kind of not as high volcano compared to, say, Mount Vesuvius or Stromboli or Mount Saint Helens. The last kind of volcano is called a cinder cone volcano. These are generally very small, a couple 100 feet tall at most, and have very low explosive activity. The lava is also generally much slower moving, so it builds up around the actual vent in the cone shape. There are a few others, but it's not worth adding more to what is already going to be an incredibly long episode. Oh, yeah, heads up, this is going to be a long one. So now we have covered the different ways volcanoes form, and we've talked about the different forms of volcanoes. Now we need to move into the different types of eruptions. Now there are three types of eruptions: magmatic, phreatomagmatic, and phreatic. Now, phreatomagmatic eruptions are primarily involving eruptions that are deep underwater, under shallow water, or under a glacier. They tend to have fairly violent underwater eruptions due to the interaction between the cold water and the superheated lava. Now, as a real quick aside, because it's hilarious, in 1831, a volcano under the Mediterranean Sea began to erupt starting on June 28th, 1831. Several boats went by the area, with one captain believing the bubbling and rumbling was a sea monster. It eventually erupted enough that it appeared above the waves of the Mediterranean on about July 12th. By July 17th, an individual from the Kingdom of Two Sicilies had sailed to the now approximately 1.5 square mile island and planted an oar on it to claim it for the Kingdom of Two Sicilies and called it Ferdinandia. Not to be outdone, of course, the British showed up on August 2nd, 1831, and claimed it as their own by planting the Union Jack on the island and calling it Graham Island. And of course, because the British did it, Spain also claimed the island. And then, as per usual, the French decided they also needed to claim the island. Now, I need to remind you, this island was barely an island and was still actively steaming and erupting. This isn't like it was some kind of very important place. The British thought they could use it to gain more control of the Mediterranean, same with Kingdom of Two Sicilies and Spain and France. But it was barely an island. It had only been up for like a month at this point. Now, this started an international dispute over this very tiny island, but before the dispute could be settled in any way, probably a war because it was 1831, the island literally disappeared beneath the waves in January of 1832. Because again, it was barely an island in the first place. It's actually not the first time this particular island has appeared above the water and then 6 or 7 months later gone back below the waters of the Mediterranean. It's kind of what it does. Anyway, little history side quest there. Back to where we were. Phreatomagmatic eruptions don't really apply to us in this episode because, well, Mount Saint Helens is neither below sea level or a glacier. The next type of eruption is called a magmatic eruption. These are categorized by actual magma and then lava coming out of what is usually the top of the volcano. There are two types of this particular eruption. There's effusive and then there's explosive. And then divided up into that, there are 5 different types of those eruptions. The first and most gentle, well, as gentle as you can get with molten rock, are Hawaiian eruptions. These are, you guessed it, named after the Hawaiian volcanoes. They are characterized by slow flowing lava that erupts over years and years and years. One of the volcanoes on one of the Hawaiian islands erupted for literally 35 years straight. By the time it finally stopped erupting in 1983, it had sent out 1.1 cubic miles of lava, made several active lava ponds, covered 55 square miles in lava, and had added about 439 acres to the island of Kilauea. Now, generally, these eruptions don't occur at the actual peak of the volcano. They most often occur in fissures along the slopes of the volcanoes. Now, often these eruptions involve chunks of lava being launched into the air at lava fountains, and these lava fountains create an interesting effect. Because they come out in chunks, the lava chunk will sometimes split into multiple pieces while remaining connected by long, incredibly thin strands of lava that rapidly cool between the two bigger chunks of lava. This thin strand of volcanic glass breaks off and is carried by the wind, sometimes great distances before landing. It is often called Pele's hair, after the Hawaiian volcanic goddess Pele. And then those bigger pieces at the end rapidly cool and form a teardrop-shaped piece of volcanic glass that is called Pele's tears. Now, on Hawaii, they often tell you not to pick up the hair because it is incredibly sharp, and if it gets stuck in you, it's very hard to get out, or it will break inside the wound and it will cause you great agony and bleeding, and it's just generally a bad idea to pick it up. So just don't pick it up. It's also bad luck. So don't do that. The next kind of volcanic eruption is called Stromboli, and this is specifically magmatic eruptions. It is named after the volcano Stromboli off the coast of Sicily. This eruption is also relatively calm. What happens here is large gas bubbles form in the magma chamber, slowly coalesce into a single large gas bubble, which eventually becomes light enough that they rise through the lava column and pop at the surface. This throws some lava up in the air in arcs. And yes, this essentially means that there is an entire volcanic eruption type where it is essentially burping. Not violently burping, just kind of burping and throwing some lava up in the air. It's like after you've drank a bunch and you kind of burp and it, like there's a little bit of spit bubbles that come out, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, because this activity can continue indefinitely, many Strombolian eruptions can literally last for thousands of years. It is theorized that Stromboli, in particular, the volcano named Stromboli, has been erupting for anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 years. For those of you Lord of the Rings fans, which I know in my audience there are many, it is theorized that J.R.R. Tolkien modeled Mount Doom after Stromboli. Another fascinating example of a Strombolian volcano is the volcano near Uapan, Mexico. It is called Paracutin. This particular volcano formed randomly one day in 1943 in the middle of a farmer's cornfield and erupted continuously for 9 years before becoming dormant in 1952. Now, there were some signs beforehand before it randomly appeared in a cornfield. Approximately 21 earthquakes of over 3.0 magnitude in the weeks leading up to the appearance of the volcano on February 20th, 1943. So, from January to February 20th, 1943, they had 21 earthquakes over 3.0 magnitude, which is indicative of something happening. In the 24 hours after it appeared, so from February 20th, 1943 to February 21st, it grew to 50 meters tall. It would continuously erupt for 9 straight years, growing to a height of over 400 meters. The two towns nearby would be forced to abandon due to the ash and lava fall from the volcano. Now, no one died specifically from the lava or the eruption, but it is reported that 3 people died from lightning generated from the pyroclastic clouds, because yes, volcanoes can also make lightning. Essentially what happens is when you have your eruption column come out, that ash and all those particles collide inside that particular cloud, which then creates friction, which then creates a difference in electrical energy, which then creates lightning. It's basically the same thing that happens in an actual storm. If you remember back to one of the tornado episodes or thunderstorm episodes where we talked about lightning, or the blackout in New York City episode, the ice particles inside clouds and all of that collide together, create friction, which then creates an electrical difference, which then creates the lightning. It's the same thing happens in volcanoes. Now, those last two were relatively to a volcano fairly chill eruptions. These aren't multi-100-mile radius events. That is about to change. The next eruption type is called volcanian. Yes, this is where we get the name volcano. Also named after the Roman god Vulcan. This one is very similar to Strombolian eruptions, except they are much more violent. These tend to explode several kilometers into the atmosphere, around 5 to 10 kilometers more or less. For my American, that's 3 to 6 miles. What happens here is the magma in the actual cone of the volcano cools and creates a cap. Gas builds up below this cap over a period of time before eventually overcoming the strength of the cap and causes a violent eruption. Very, very similar to a cap in thunderstorms. And then we have Pelean eruptions. These are named after Mount Pelée in Martinique, which was the deadliest volcanic eruption in recorded history, with nearly 30,000 people killed when the entire town of Saint Pierre was completely destroyed. These are made in a similar way as the others, a collapsing lava dome within the vent at the top of the volcano. This lava dome starts to swell at the top of the mountain before it collapses in on itself. This collapse sends massive pyroclastic flows down the sides of the volcano, and a pyroclastic flow is essentially a landslide of superheated gases, volcanic ash, and chunks of volcanic rocks. We're talking 400 to 1300 degrees Fahrenheit, 200 to 700 degrees Celsius. These move at incredibly fast speeds down the slopes of the volcano at nearly 50 miles an hour, and if you manage to survive the temperatures, you'll likely be buried below what is likely at least 6 feet of scalding hot volcanic rock at best, 700 feet of it at worst. These are generally that large because oftentimes it's the entire top of the volcano collapsing down and sending these massive landslides down the slopes. The final eruption type is the Plinian eruption. This type is named after Pliny the Elder for what he observed during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. This is generally the most violent type of eruption. We're talking volcanic material launched into the actual stratosphere, massive pyroclastic flows rolling down the mountainside, and what happens here is essentially the same as the others. High pressure gas bubbles within the magma rise to the surface and explode. This happens over and over and over again, launching volcanic material to incredibly high altitudes in the atmosphere, upwards of 30 miles up. Like, we're talking actual stratosphere. These also generally produce large amounts of pyroclastic flows that are extraordinarily large compared to the others, like multiple mile distances. In addition, there is an eruption called an ultra-Plinian. These are for the Plinian eruptions that are extra gigantic. It's a Plinian eruption, it's just bigger. These are the Yellowstones, things like that. The stuff that would absolutely cause planet-wide disruptions. And if you're thinking, all of these sound very similar to each other, well, they are. Some of the main differences between them is the type of rock material that is ejected. But the other thing is, most volcanic eruptions are a combination of various types as well. Often you'll have a Pelean eruption and a Plinian eruption in the same eruption cycle. So then what is the difference between all of these eruptions? It's the type of magma or lava. Oh yes, another classification. So the first two types of eruptions, magmatic eruptions that is, Hawaiian and Strombolian, are characterized by their relatively fast-moving and free-flowing lava. This is due to the actual content of the molten rock. It is primarily basaltic, which is low in silica content. This means that the lava is low in viscosity, and therefore, especially in Strombolian eruptions, the bubbles that form in the magma that create the eruption have a much lower level of pressure needed to actually pop. Then with volcanic eruptions, your primary lava content is andesite, which is a middle level of silica content, which means there is more pressure needed to actually pop your magma bubble, meaning the eruption is larger. And then your last two eruptions are primarily rhyolite. This is the most viscous lava and has the highest silica content. This means that the higher the rhyolite content in the lava, the higher the pressure needed to actually break that bubble and create an eruption, which is why they're significantly more powerful. More pressure needed for an eruption, the bigger the eruption in general. And then the last type of eruption is a phreatic eruption. Now, we're going to talk a lot about phreatic eruptions in this episode because they are extremely common and they're the most common type of eruptions just because they are an interaction of magma and groundwater. So as your volcano is becoming more active, the groundwater sitting in the actual ground above the magma area, I guess is the best way to put it, that heat interacts with that groundwater and it explodes out and it shoots out like old volcanic material, old ash, old rock, all of that kind of stuff. But it happens on a regular basis. It's not an actual magmatic eruption. No magma is coming out. No lava is coming out because it's literally just basically a steam explosion coming out of the ground from an interaction between the water in the ground and the magma underneath the volcano. Now, I know this has been a very long introduction, and I promise you I have somehow made it significantly shorter. I went into a very, very, very deep rabbit hole on volcanoes to do this episode. But this is a disaster podcast after all, and we need all of the context in which to provide background on what is going to be actually covered in the actual disaster. I thank you for sticking with me. I know we're 20 minutes in already, but we are on our last classification of volcanoes. This is the very last one, I promise. The actual scale classification for volcanoes. So, hurricanes have the Saffir-Simpson scale, tornadoes have the EF scale. We have a scale for classifying volcanoes. It is the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or simply VEI. This scale goes from 0 all the way up to 8. The VEI is based on 3 categories: the amount of material ejected, the height of the eruption into the atmosphere, and how long the eruption lasts. Similar to the Richter scale and moment magnitude scale for earthquakes, the VEI scale is logarithmic. Essentially, what that means is as you go up a level on the scale, you have a 10 times worse volcano. So from VEI to VEI 1, the amount of erupted tephra, this is what is ejected by the volcano, goes up from 0.0001 cubic kilometers to 0.001 cubic kilometers. At the very top of the scale, the massively catastrophic, nearly impossible to describe levels of damage is 1,000 cubic kilometers of material ejected. I don't even know how to put that into perspective for you. The best way I can describe it is imagine the entirety of Disney World in Florida being launched into the air. Yes, the entirety of Disney World launched into the air. The next is the height of the eruption into the atmosphere. At the very bottom, we have 0.1 kilometers into the air to a middle-of-the-road eruption, which is about 25 kilometers. And then at the very top, we have all the way to the stratosphere, which is about 50 kilometers up. And then the length of the eruption is literally just how long it takes to erupt. So anywhere from less than an hour on the bottom end to 12 plus hours at the top end. So, with that, we move on to our actual subject of our episode today, Mount Saint Helens. Now, Mount Saint Helens is a part of the Cascade Mountain Range in southwestern Washington state in the United States. It was named by a British explorer by the name of George Vancouver. Yes, that Vancouver, after British diplomat Alan Fitzherbert. Yes, that is his real name, who was the Baron of St. Helens. So, the guy who founded Vancouver named St. Helens after a guy whose last name was Fitzherbert, who was the Baron of St. Helens. He was not, they didn't name it Mount Fitzherbert, which would have been significantly better. Anyway, to start this episode with, I want to give you some background on the particular volcano. Now, first off, we're going to cover the Native American story of how this particular volcano was formed because, one, it is important to remember the stories of those who lived here first, and two, it's an incredibly cool story. This comes to us from the Klickitat tribe in Washington and Oregon. There are others that are told, but this is by far the most common one that I was able to find. So, a long time ago, the Klickitat of the area had a hard time crossing what is now known as the Columbia River. And Manito, the great spirit of the Klickitat, decided to build the people of the land a stone bridge for them to cross. He realized this was an incredibly important landmark, so he sent a wise woman to be the bridge's guardian, a woman by the name of Lou Witt. At the same time, Manito sent his 3 sons down to earth as 3 mountains: Multnomah, the warrior, which is now Mount Rainier; Klickitat, the totem maker, which is now Mount Adams; and Wy'east, the singer, which is now Mount Hood. The people used the bridge to travel across, and the sons used it to visit each other on either side of the river. Because of this, the people named the Bridge of the Gods. But it was not to last. Soon, a new mountain sprung up, a young woman known as Squaw Mountain. Now, Squaw Mountain was madly in love with Wy'east, but she also enjoyed flirting with his brother Klickitat. This caused the 2 brothers to begin to fight and argue. They yelled and spewed hot rocks and set great swaths of the forest on fire in their battles. Eventually, their fighting became so terrible, their rocks landed upon the bridge of the gods, and the ground shook around it and collapsed it into the river. Eventually, the fight came to a head, and Klickitat won, and Squaw Mountain joined Klickitat by his side, but soon after she became incredibly depressed because she truly loved Wyeast, but she was not allowed to be by his side, so she laid down and never got up again. Squaw Mountain is now known as Sleeping Beauty and is the mountain just west of the modern-day Mount Adams. Now, when Squaw Mountain fell, Klickitat became full of grief and bowed his head in shame towards his fallen love, and that is why Mount Adams does not have a steep peak. Wyeast, however, remained tall and proud, waiting on his love to return, and Mount Hood retains its tall and steep peak. In the fighting, though, Luit fell when the bridge collapsed in an attempt to calm the brothers and prevent their fight from continuing. When Manito heard what Luit had done and her enduring loyalty to guarding the bridge, he revived her and gave her one wish. She wished to be young and beautiful, and the Great Spirit granted her that wish, turning her into the youngest mountain in the range, the volcano known today as Mount Saint Helens, or to the Klickitat, Luala Klo. Now, the interesting part of that whole story is there actually was a natural land bridge over the Columbia River in that area for a period of time. A massive landslide occurred that dammed the Columbia River for a short time before it successfully eroded through the bottom of it. It made an actual land bridge that went across the Columbia River that people regularly used to walk across and travel across the river. That particular land bridge lasted for a couple hundred years before an earthquake collapsed the bridge in about 1700 and created the Cascade Rapids near the Cascade Locks. So the story is at least somewhat rooted in reality of explaining why that particular bridge is there and why there are three massive mountains in Washington. Now, for the geographic history of Mount St. Helens, we're going to travel all the way back to the Pleistocene, or as many of us know it, the Ice Age about 37,000 years ago. This is the first evidence we have of an eruptive period for Mount St. Helens, known as the Ape Canyon eruptive period. This eruptive period likely lasted somewhere around 5,000 or so years, occurred in four main sections. The volcano went dormant for a while being about 15,000 years, and then after that resuming eruptions in the next eruptive period, known as the Cougar eruptive period, about 20,000 years ago. This lasted for about 2,000 years, before the volcano again fell dormant for about 5,000 years to 13,000 years ago. The next eruptive period, known as the Swift Creek eruptive period, was marked by many extreme eruptions that sent ashfall as far as central Washington on repeated occasions up until about 8,000 years ago. The next one was the Smith Creek eruptive period. This one was a fairly large one and covered large swaths of Washington, Oregon, and Canada with volcanic material. After that was the Pine Creek eruptive period. This was a short-lived one characterized primarily by extremely hot pyroclastic flows that happened over and over and over again. Now after that, we're starting to reach the more modern eruption period. The next period of eruptive activity was the Castle Creek period, when the modern mountainside of Mount St. Helens began to be constructed. Many of the eruptions at this time were accompanied by significant lava flows which built up the iconic cone that would be observed prior to 1980. There was another eruptive period around 700 CE or so, known as the Kalama eruptive period, then another one that started around 1800 to about 1857, and this is the first known written record of eruptions at Mount St. Helens. In fact, one of the eruptions in 1831 launched a large amount of ash into the atmosphere, which changed the color of the sky throughout the U.S. And it is thought that this eruption is what Nat Turner took as his final sign to launch his slave rebellion in Virginia, as it caused the skies to turn an odd bluish-green color, and he took that as a sign from the heavens to launch the slave revolt. Now, whether or not it was actually that is still up for debate, but it is a possibility. Now, with that, we are now up to 1980. Now, prior to 1980, Mount St. Helens was incredibly popular with hikers and campers. It was perfectly symmetrical and an incredibly breathtaking sight, and the area all around it was full of gorgeous forests and fishing full of fish and wildlife and large game and small game. It was incredibly beautiful with some fantastic trees, and it was a great place to hike. Frequently, Mount St. Helens was known as the Fuji of America after the legendary Mount Fuji in Japan. Mount St. Helens was about 9,600 feet tall and stood out significantly among the hills surrounding it because it was significantly taller and was also snow-capped year-round. It is a stratovolcano that was created from the subduction of the Juan de Fuca continental plate, which is a plate just off the coast of North America, that has been shoved under the North American plate, creating the Cascade Volcanic Arc. Now, our story officially starts on March 15th, 1980. Seismographs around the area began to pick up small earthquakes in and around Mount St. Helens. There had been smaller earthquakes around the volcano before. It was a volcano after all, and nothing out of the ordinary was really expected. The earthquakes did seem to be happening at a higher rate, though. From about the 15th to the 20th of March of 1980, they experienced nearly 100 earthquakes around the volcano. The USGS, U.S. Geological Service, very quickly brought their scientists to the volcano to record and understand what was happening. One of the very first was a volcanologist by the name of David Johnston. He would spend the majority of the next few months on the mountain in some capacity, and was one of the leaders of the groups of scientists studying the volcano leading up to the main eruption. Now, for those first 5 days or so, it kind of seemed as business as usual around Mount St. Helens. The amount of earthquakes was odd, but it wasn't super out of the ordinary. That was up until March 20th, 1980 at about 3:47 p.m. On that afternoon, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake rocked the area. It was extremely shallow on the northeast side of the mountain and set off numerous avalanches down the flanks of the volcano. This one, however, got their attention. So they set up more monitors around the volcano and began to really pay attention. On Friday, March 21st, earthquake activity seemed to pick up, and seismologists from the University of Washington warned the U.S. Forestry Service that it would likely cause further avalanches. They did not say, however, that they had begun to have a sneaking suspicion that this was volcano-related. So normally when you have an earthquake, you have aftershocks, and slowly those aftershocks fade out. We talked about this during the Valdivia episode especially. So seismologists expected the 4.2 magnitude earthquake to be the main shock and then the aftershocks to fade out over the next several days. The problem with this is that the exact opposite happened. More and more and more earthquakes began to happen. This is when they realized, yeah, this is probably volcanic activity related. They were literally recording 20 earthquakes per hour at several points. That is a ton of earthquake activity. On March 25th alone, they had 25 earthquakes at a magnitude 4 or higher. This is when the U.S. Forestry Service decided it was time to close the mountain above the tree line and suggested to everyone living and working in the area of the mountain to evacuate out of concern for avalanches. Many people took that advice, except one man, Harry R. Truman. Not to be confused with Harry S. Truman. This was not a president. It was not the president. Harry R. Truman owned the Mount Saint Helens Lodge at Spirit Lake. Now, Spirit Lake is a lake on the north end of the mountain. It's a very large lake. It's freshwater. It sits right on the northern end of the mountain. Harry Truman was generously a grumpy individual. He was well known in the area for generally causing all sorts of problems up and down the mountain. Poaching, pretending to be a park ranger. He once ran someone off because he didn't want to rent to them because he thought he was old and then realized who it was. It was a very famous judge, so he ran him down to actually convince him to stay. When Washington passed a new tax law, he refused to use the new tax law and charge people with the old tax law. Generally, he was not a pleasant person in general. The U.S. Forestry Service asked him in March of 1980 if he would evacuate, and he was adamant that he would not, saying, quote, "I don't have any idea whether it will blow, but I don't believe it to the point I'm going to pack up," end quote. And so he stayed. We will be back to Harry Truman later. On March 26, 1980, they had their 100th earthquake of 3.5 or higher since March 20th. This is basically constant shaking at this point. Looking at the seismic recordings, it is nearly impossible to tell when one earthquake stops and another begins. It's just constant, up and down shaking. Then on March 27th, Mount Saint Helens began to erupt. At approximately 12:30 p.m., a loud boom was reported from the volcano. An individual flying around the area reported a column of ash and smoke emitting from the volcano. At 2 p.m. that day, there was a 4.7 magnitude earthquake, followed by a black plume of smoke that was approximately 7,000 feet high. This explosion created a 200 to 250 foot crater in the top of the volcano. Cracks also began to appear all around the top of the mountain, and the massive concern that there would soon be a major landslide grew. It was at this point the U.S. Forestry Service decided, it's time for everybody to go, and evacuated everyone within 15 miles of the volcano. That included numerous individuals and homes, a couple hundred loggers in the area, and all U.S. Forestry Service employees in the area. Everyone was out, except Harry Truman. He would not budge. The sheriff's department then set up roadblocks leading to the mountain, except leaving Harry Truman behind them, because again, that man was not going anywhere. On March 29th, a second crater, approximately the same size as the one that first appeared on March 27th, appeared to the west of that crater. During the night from the 29th to the 30th, a blue flame was visible at first in the first crater, then the second, then it jumped back and forth between the two craters. Volcanologist David Johnston said it was likely burning gas emissions from the volcano, mostly hydrogen sulfide. At this point, the volcano being active again had become a widely known subject. The actual roads to the mountain were closed, but it was impossible to do anything about the air. Dozens of planes were flying over Mount Saint Helens a day by this point, hoping to get a look into the craters at the top of the mountain and maybe see it erupt. Now, back on the ground, activity continued. March 30th had 58 earthquakes over a 3.0 magnitude. Ash had begun to fall on neighboring towns around the base of the volcano. Scientific testing of the ashfall had indicated that the vast majority of it was made up of older magma fragments that were part of the volcano crater already, and wasn't any new magma coming up from below ground yet. Right around March 31st is when we start to really see the human spirit of this coming out. The U.S. Forestry Service and USGS were receiving daily phone calls from gamblers asking how many earthquakes and eruptions had happened in the previous 24 hours, likely because they were placing over-under bets, because of course they were. People were setting up protests at the roadblocks because they wanted to get closer to the mountain, and also because some of them were unable to reach their cabins in the forests around the mountain. Many individuals reported that the roads leading to the mountain began to look like Seattle at rush hour. There were cars parked on either side of the road for miles away from the mountain, all people trying to get a look at the ongoing eruptions. Some people even set up mini stores out of the back of their vans to sell t-shirts that they had designed showing off the smoking mountain, because of course they did. This is America after all. If you can make a buck on it, someone's gonna do it. And that was just the main roads. There were dozens upon dozens of logging roads that the sheriff's department literally could not effectively block 24/7. They only have so many sheriffs, and there's just absolutely no way that they can take care of and put roadblocks up on all of those logging roads. They actually requested the National Guard to help with roadblocks because they were having so many problems. The flights over the active volcano had reached a ridiculous point, with nearly 100 planes attempting to fly over the smoking crater a day. That is a lot of planes. That I can't imagine 100 planes trying to fly over the exact same spot in the same day. You're getting multiple an hour, and it's likely most of them are going to be during the day. So you generously have about 12 hours where you have 100 planes trying to get as close to an actively erupting volcano as they possibly can. That would be incredibly stressful for a lot of people, because if you have a plane accident, plane crash up there, they're gonna be dead. It's gonna take too long to get anyone there. You also have to worry about the safety of first responders because, again, the volcano is actively erupting. Nothing major at this point, but it's a volcano. It could go at any time. And then to top it all off, one pilot called the flights over Mount Saint Helens at this time a dogfight over the crater because there were so many planes bobbing and weaving in and out of each other. Planes would maintain radio silence and fly as low as possible to avoid the FAA entirely, because if they're high enough, radar will pick them up and the FAA will get on their radio and say, hey, that's a restricted airspace, don't go in there. But if they fly low enough, they can fly below radar, and if they don't respond to their radio, no one is there to tell them, hey, you can't do that. And what are they going to do? Shoot them down? No, they're not. They might arrest them when they get back. But again, they're just going to fly below radar, and if it's a private plane and they're not, putting in all the information needed to actually track them, then who's going to catch them? And there were just so many of them doing it, it was effectively meaningless to try and actually enforce. Now, through all of that, all of the hundreds of earthquakes at this point, the multiple eruptions, all of that, Harry R. Truman still flat out refused to leave. There have been avalanches. There have been earthquakes over 4.0, multiple at this point. There have been 100 or so earthquakes over 3.0 magnitude at this point. And this man refused to leave. He told one newspaper, quote, I think the whole damn thing is over-exaggerated. Spirit Lake and Mount Saint Helens are my life. You couldn't pull me out with a mule team. I've lived here over 50 years. That mountain's part of Harry, and Harry's a part of that mountain. Now, to give you an idea of why Harry became such a celebrity during the lead up to the eruption, he was first of all very cantankerous and was quite willing to tell anyone and everyone with a microphone just how much he was not leaving. And his reason for not leaving was likely twofold. Number one, he was old and widowed and just didn't want to and was absolutely refusing to leave his home, which is understandable. But number two, if the volcano didn't erupt, all those interviews were free advertising. He gets to go on the news and be cantankerous and grumpy and give out these ridiculous quotes and make a giant spectacle of himself and how he was the one that refused to leave. Then he gets free advertising for his particular lodge on Spirit Lake and Mount Saint Helens. And then another reason that he was quite interesting in this particular saga is because of where his lodge was located. It was on the south end of Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake is north of Mount Saint Helens. So his lodge was quite literally on the base of the volcano. He was approximately a mile from the crater, well within what would be a reasonable estimation of the eruption zone. And he did not care. He didn't care. They had geologists, they had volcanologists, they had the police, they had the state police, they had the National Guard. Anyone and everyone who could possibly try and convince this man to leave. And he flat out refused to. And he was explained that if Mount St. Helens does in fact erupt, you will be going with it. And he did not care. So then, the next day is April 1st. And if you're not in the United States, I don't actually know in the rest of the world. Anyway, April Fool's Day is April 1st. And on April 1st, something extraordinary happened. All the way across the country, near Milton, Massachusetts, a local news station outside Boston, WNAC-TV, reported that a local hill called Great Blue Hill began to erupt and spew lava onto nearby homes of unsuspecting residents. The report showed lava running down a hill and ash high in the atmosphere. It showed a clip of President Jimmy Carter saying he was gravely concerned, and the Massachusetts governor at the time saying that the situation was very serious. One reporter said that the eruption was caused by a geological chain reaction in connection with Mount Saint Helens. Except the entire thing was an elaborate April Fool's joke. The reporter then held up a sign at the end that said April Fools with an exclamation point, but as we know, many people stopped watching immediately after the eruption portion. It actually showed clips of Mount St. Helens, but made it seem like it was in Massachusetts, This was prior to the internet, so the local police department was immediately inundated with concerned residents trying to figure out what they should do. The news stations had the ire of their viewers directed at them and issued an apology at their 11 p.m. news broadcast. The producer who okayed the entire thing was fired the next day for failing to identify stock footage as such in violation of FCC rules and also for failure to exercise good news judgment. And then, in actuality, more earthquakes were recorded on April 1st on actual Mount St. Helens as well, just so you didn't think the volcano decided to take a day off to celebrate April Fool's Day. By April 2nd, things had started to change. Eruptions were still happening. Earthquakes were still happening, kind of. You see, there's a normal earthquake, which is a sudden, intense shaking that peters out quickly. So, if you think about looking at an actual printout from a Richter scale, you have it goes up and down. It makes a drawing, and it goes up and down really fast, and then it slowly peters out to a solid line again. That is a normal earthquake. You have those big waves that slowly go down to smaller waves. Then there's a thing called a harmonic tremor. This is an earthquake that has a consistent wave for a period of time. And so what that means is with the earthquake, you have those big waves at the beginning, and then they slowly peter out, and almost like a pyramid, a sideways pyramid shape. Harmonic tremors have waves that are the exact same size for a significant period of time. They don't change. It's exactly the same amount of shaking the entire time. Harmonic tremors mean only one thing. Magma is moving below the surface of the earth. Also, the ash eruptions continued on as well and really began to spread around the area. Ash had begun to fall into the local rivers and lakes and things like that and increased the acidity of that water and caused harm to local fisheries. And just so you didn't think that this was over, more attempts to circumvent the roadblocks were also consistent on this day. But the real big deal was they had these harmonic tremors, which indicated that the volcano was very much active and was very much had a potential to erupt violently at any time. April 3rd, more eruptions, more earthquakes, more harmonic tremors. This was also the day that the governor of Washington, Dixie Lee Ray, declared a state of emergency around the volcano. Then on April 4th, USGS volcanologists and hydrologists decided to set up an observation post approximately 8.5 miles northwest of the volcano. They placed numerous recording devices at this location and named it Coldwater after the mountain it was sitting on, Coldwater Peak. It was little more than a tent where they would drive up the road to use the recording devices and collect data related to the ongoings of the volcano, and then they would head back. Now, part of this that often gets overlooked is the logging impact of closing Mount St. Helens. Many individuals who lived in the area relied upon steady work performing logging in the area. When the mountain was closed, they completely shut down all logging activities within several dozen miles of the actual mountain. This sudden lack of work put many individuals out of a job for what would be quite some time, which is one of those things that doesn't super get talked about, is that when you have close downs for, emergency situations such as a Mount St. Helens eruption or earthquake recovery or hurricane recovery or tornado recovery, is it can often put people that should still have work if it was still open out of work for a significant period of time, which then causes more problems down the road. In addition to that, the National Guard took over roadblocks and moved the roadblock on State Route 503 west of Cougar. This essentially cut off the town from the outside world, a town that significantly relied on tourists to survive. As you can imagine, this was not a popular decision. This setup would last approximately 3 days before the residents of Cougar threatened to sue the state, and they moved the roadblock back east of the town to allow tourists in again, because this area is also heavily reliant on tourism. So that's another thing that really gets overlooked when you talk about these particular disasters. If you have an extensive period of time where an area is shut down due to what is expected to happen, or what has already happened and needs to be recovered from, you lose that tourist's interest. They can't go there. They're not going to come there and spend money. People that rely on that money to live, feed their families, live their lives, all of that, are going to have a very hard time. So it's going to be one of those things you have to balance between the two. And in this case, they decided that it was not worth it to cut Cougar off from the rest of the world. And then the other unintended consequence of moving this roadblock was more people decided to just avoid the roadblocks entirely and follow the logging roads. They had significantly more trespassing after this roadblock was moved and then moved back than they did before it was moved, because they realized that they could just avoid it altogether. For the next week or so, from April 5th to April 12th or so, things continued on like this. Eruptions would occur, earthquakes were recorded, harmonic tremors were recorded, off and on throughout each day. But the main thing to understand from this time period is early in the week, USGS hydrologists, geologists, and volcanologists noticed something. The north face of the mountain was bulging outward. It was hard to tell at first, but by April 7th it was very clear. A 1.5 square mile section of the north side of Mount Saint Helens had bulged outward approximately 270 feet. Behind this bulge, the crater had grown significantly. It was now around 1,700 feet by 1,200 feet across and nearly 500 feet deep. Scientists realized pretty early on, once they discovered the now bulging mountain, that it was very, very important to keep an eye on that. A 1.5 square mile landslide would be catastrophic in a way no one would be prepared for. The area that was bulging out was from the east end of the volcano at a rocky outcropping called Dog's Head, and moving all the way over to another rock outcropping known as Goat Rock's Dome. So basically, between those two, that entire section of mountain had shoved its way outward and slightly tilted down. So it's not moving downward, it's going out and tilting. The top is tilting outward. On April 12th, security around the volcano changed. It turns out it is incredibly expensive to have round-the-clock roadblocks for what would soon be an entire month. Most of the sheriffs that were running the roadblocks had left already, and approximately 75 National Guard had been called up to man the roadblocks. On April 12th, that number of National Guardmen dropped to 11. The sheriffs had left because it was expensive to pay for that much overtime, and also they were constantly being harassed and protested against, and they were tired of it. Many, many people wanted a chance to get on the mountain and were very upset that they were blocked from doing so. They were also a subset of people who had cabins in the area who were very angry that they were denied entry to see their cabins. After this reduction to a skeleton crew of National Guard watching the roadblocks, incursions became much, much more common. 2 hikers were caught on the actual summit of the volcano, allegedly there to film beer commercials. 2 news stations out of Seattle used helicopters to land on the summit to film news footage. It was a constant game of try to keep people off the actively erupting volcano that no one seemed to really want to fight. If they're going to climb the spewing hot sulfur and smoke volcano, well, I guess let them. From April 13th to April 23rd or so, the volcano chilled out a bit. There were still daily earthquakes, but they were significantly less frequent. They also had the occasional eruption, but nothing like before. Now, these eruptions up to this point have all been phreatic eruptions. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but these are all from magma reacting with groundwater in the actual volcano, or water melting from the snow cap. There was a couple glaciers on top of Mount Saint Helens, and so the heat from the magma was reacting with the water that had melted from the glaciers and the snow, as well as the groundwater, and was creating these basically steam eruptions all over Mount Saint Helens. These are old volcanic rock and steam and ash that had already been there and are just erupting because of that hot cold interaction. It's like if you heat up a piece of glass really, really, really hot and then you stick it in cold water, it shatters and explodes. It's basically the same thing as that. The heat is coming up from below, interacting with the super cold and going boom and shooting up. There have not been, to this point, any magmatic eruptions or anything like that. There have been numerous landslides. There have been numerous avalanches, just small landslides, small avalanches, but no magmatic eruptions, no pyroclastic flows. Everything to this point has been phreatic. Everything is a steam explosion or old volcanic ash or volcanic dust or things like that. Now, it seemed like the volcano was starting to fall back asleep. On April 18th, USGS decided to do a twice-week update on the volcano instead of daily. It was really starting to chill. And several scientists had been removed from the rotation of gathering data because, again, having that many people around the clock is expensive, and when it seems like the volcano is starting to go back dormant again, it becomes very difficult to prove that you need that many people and you need all of that funding to do that. But there was something that the local scientists to the area realized. This was very far from over. They realized on April 19th that the area that was bulging outward they had previously noticed was actually moving further outward. It wasn't just it bulged out slightly and that was its new spot. It was continuously moving further outward. Very, very slowly at first, but soon at a much faster pace. Everyone agreed this massive wall of mountain was moving. What they disagreed on was why. Some thought it was because of the subsidence from the crater behind the bulge, which basically means that the crater was moving down and was creating a void space for the bulge to move outward and downward. Some thought it was magma bulging up from underground, causing the entire mountain to move. Either way, this is a bad scenario because either way, eventually that giant piece of mountain is going to let go, cause a massive landslide, and possibly a gigantic eruption. That mass of ground was estimated to be 150 feet thick, and once again, in case you forgot, 1.5 square miles. That is a large amount of moving material. If it let go, not only would anyone downslope from it for a good distance have absolutely zero time to evacuate, it would also likely set off a massive eruption from the volcano. If you're wondering who is in direct path of this massive bulge of volcano, that is correct, Harry R. Truman. By April 22nd, actual eruptions, the phreatic eruptions, more or less ceased. There were fumaroles, small escapes of volcanic gas and steams from cracks, but nothing explosive at all. It's literally just like the mountain is off-gassing. It's not erupting, it's not exploding, it's just steam coming up out of the ground. It had been calm, besides some steam venting, that the USGS considered reopening parts of the mountain on April 23rd to activity. Like, it had been chill. There had been very few earthquakes. There had been no eruptions. It was literally just the steam coming out of the ground, and they were receiving massive public pressure to reopen this volcano, and they were kind of leaning towards it. The bulge continued to be an area of grave concern. At this point, they were pretty convinced it was mostly from magma pushing up from underneath, but no one could know for certain. And that's really the reason they didn't reopen the mountains, because if that bulge goes, you have, number one, the largest landslide in recorded history, and number two, a likely massive eruption directly behind it. Because, again, you need that bubble that is in that magma to be broken to cause this eruption, and losing a 1.5 square mile area of mountain would likely be enough to set off that eruption. Now, when they had first noticed the bulge on the mountain, several tilt meters were placed on the bulge to measure how far and how much the bulge was tilting. From April 23rd to April 27th, the bulge moved approximately 20 to 25 feet northward towards Spirit Lake. It was also tilting downward at a much faster rate. The problem with this was the rest of the volcano was very chill. There wasn't even steam rising high enough to make it out of the crater. Earthquakes were slowing down, but yet this giant mound of earth was still moving 5 to 6 feet a day away from the mountain. If it let go, it would reach Spirit Lake in at most 2 minutes. There would be no warning, no way to escape, instant death for anyone caught there. But it is hard to put into words so the average person can understand what this particular risk is. You could say, yeah, the entire mountain is going to come down on you, and they're going to think you're exaggerating. But in this case, it is a little bit of an exaggeration. It's only half the mountain coming down on you. That's still a lot of mountain. All the average person can see is you being what sounds like ridiculous because we've never seen half of a mountain fall before, but also an absolutely gorgeous mountain they have likely grown up being around, grown up hiking on, spent a good amount of time and have good memories on, and want to go hiking or go home, or if they were a logger, they want to go out and log wood or do whatever. They're not seeing this risk. You can't, that area of mountain is so large that you can't tell with the naked eye that it's moving because it's just so vast. All they see is you saying, no, this whole side of the mountain is moving, and them looking at it and going, it looks like the same mountain to me, and they just have to trust you that you know what you're doing. And as we can see today, many people struggle to trust experts. That was the same problem in 1980. That has always been a problem. People have always struggled to trust experts in what they know. And they just see what they want to see, and they want to enjoy things, and they want to be able to go and do what they want. And there's no explosions happening. It was significantly easier to keep at least the vast majority of people away when explosions were happening daily to, distract people, to keep them out. Like, hey, don't go here. The mountain is literally exploding. Now, it's quiet. There's some steam here and there, but it's not really doing much of anything else. And there's significantly less earthquakes as well. So it doesn't even seem like the mountain is about to go. And without, again, seeing the measurements yourself, it's hard to tell that a landmass that size is moving. It's just hard to comprehend. And so the USGS and the U.S. Forestry Service were under immense pressure by the public and likely politicians saying, hey, open this because, again, we're losing tourist money. We're losing logging money. We're losing all of this economy. People in the area that I represent in government or whoever represent in government are calling me daily saying, you are keeping us out for no good reason. That volcano is not going to erupt. It's completely silent, and it has been for days. Let me go do my job. Let me go visit where I want to visit. Let me go live my life. Let me go back to my home. That is incredibly hard to ignore, especially when you can't really give them a good concrete example of why specifically they cannot go back. Fortunately, the governor actually listened to the USGS and on April 30th issued a red zone 3 to 7 miles out from the peak of the volcano. This zone restricted access to only scientists, law enforcement, and government officials. Again, this was not a popular decision, especially, again, because the volcano looked completely serene. But that bulge kept growing and moving away from the mountain. Beyond that red zone, a good distance, was a blue zone. That blue zone was only accessible to those with a special pass and only during daylight hours, basically loggers and people who owned property in the area. Now, this whole time, reporters kept going back to visit our dear friend Harry Truman at Mount Saint Helens Lodge at Spirit Lake. And he was more than happy to keep giving interviews. He had been repeatedly told by the Sheriff's Department and the National Guard and the State Police and scientists and anyone else that he needed to evacuate. He was explained to by hydrologists and geologists and volcanologists that he needed to evacuate, yet he refused them all. At one point, he told reporters that the constant earthquakes fully knocked him out of bed. So, he laid a mattress on the floor of the basement and slept on that. He told reporters, quote, "That mountain doesn't dare blow up on me. I've walked that mountain for 50 years. I know her. If it erupts with lava, it's not going to get me at Spirit Lake." He flat out refused to budge. He told some reporters he had a place to go if it got too bad, where he could hold up with his 16 cats that he claimed to have stocked full of food and 2 barrels of whiskey. But Truman wasn't just adamant that he wasn't leaving. He had solutions too, at one point telling local news, quote, "If I had anything to do with it, I'd have dropped a bomb right down in the middle of it. Ice would have filled the hole and it would have been all over all at once." Now, technically, this is not wrong. If they had indeed decided to bomb the volcano, it very well probably would have set off that landslide, the eruption, and made it all over for Harry Truman because he would be buried below several hundred feet of mountain. So, he at least inadvertently knew what he was talking about. By this point in the eruption cycle, Truman was convinced that the mountain was done erupting. It was over. He told the news, quote, "The mountain has shot its wad and it hasn't hurt my place a bit. But those goddamn geologists with their hair down to their butts wouldn't pay no attention to old Truman," end quote. So, maybe he didn't actually know what he was talking about. Now, if you remember way back to the beginning of this, there was a volcanologist by the name of David Johnston working this particular event. He was well known in the volcano community and was instrumental in keeping the volcano closed off to the general public for the duration of this event. He knew volcanoes, and he knew them well. On April 30th, a famous photo was taken of him climbing down the crater on Mount Saint Helens to test the water of the lake that had formed in the crater of the mountain for its chemical composition. It is a deeply wild photo to look at, and I can't imagine what it would be like to be there. Everything around him is gray. He is literally the only color in the photo. Everything else is gray, and it is a color photograph. It's not a black and white photograph. It is a color photograph. He is the only color. His clothes and him are the only color in the photograph because everything else is a mixture of white, black, and gray. There is smoke and fumes everywhere, hugging close to the ground. The crater would be constantly vibrating ever so slightly from the consistent earthquakes and harmonic tremors, which David would know was magma moving directly below his feet. The stench of sulfur would be overwhelming, and it was an incredibly steep drop down into this crater that didn't exist over a little month prior. He would likely be one of the only, if not the only, person to ever get this close to the actual mouth of the volcano before the eruption. It's literally, it's like something you see in a video game. It's like you're playing No Man's Sky is the best way I can explain it. If you've ever played No Man's Sky, it's a game where you explore other worlds and moons and other planets and all that. And that's what it looks like. There is nothing living. It is completely gray. It is completely rock. There is steam and ash everywhere. And it's just, or like an old war game or a war movie or a movie of where the aliens have invaded the planet and it's been annihilated and nothing is left but cold gray stone. That's all you could see in the crater of Mount Saint Helens on April 30th. It's just hard to comprehend. And in the photo, he is so small compared to this massive crater. It's one thing where you have a picture where you can tell that it's zoomed in, he looks like a normal sized person. He looks tiny in the photograph, and you can't even see the blue sky because it's so gray and there's so much steam and ash in the air. It's just, it's an alien world. It's crazy. And to top all of that off, he knew full well that the mountain could decide to erupt while he's standing in it. Literally, in the mouth of this particular volcano, it could decide to erupt and kill him instantly. He knew better than anyone that the bulge on the side of the mountain was growing. He knew if it gave way, it would likely be enough energy to set off a catastrophic eruption. He knew that if it happened while he was in the crater, he was dead. 100% dead. Zero chance of survival. But he risked his life to do so to further our knowledge of volcanoes and what makes them work. And he did it over and over and over again numerous times. On May 1st, well over a month since the first signs of activity began to appear around the volcano was still eerily silent. There were more earthquakes, of course, and steam still billowed from within, but there were no eruptions and no explosions. The USGS also set up Cold Water 2 a little further away from the summits of Mount Helens as well. They had time-lapse cameras and other recording equipment set up at this location to make sure everything was caught if the volcano did finally go. They also set up a camper at this site 5 miles north of the volcano, in perfect sight of the now rapidly growing mound, because this location was going to be staffed 24 hours a day for the foreseeable future. Then on May 2nd, we had more of the same. Fumaroles, earthquakes, no explosions. More people trying to get passes to hike the mountain than complaining when they were told no. May 3rd through the 6th were still quiet. No explosions, earthquakes, but nothing else. By this point, since March 20th, there had been 2,550 earthquakes of 3.0 magnitude or greater, and 291 earthquakes higher than a 4.0 magnitude. Now, the quietness of the volcano was coming to an end. On May 7th, the eruptions began again. Phreatic eruptions, but eruptions again. And they were being launched several thousand feet in the air. On May 8th, avalanches were observed up and down the mountain for the first time in 2 weeks. Some were nearly 100 feet in width and 1,000 feet long. Explosions also continued to occur on the mountain around the crater, and that bulge continued to move, somewhere around 5 to 6 feet a day. Things continued on like this for the next several days. Phreatic steam eruptions, earthquakes, the like. The volcano was falling into another steady state, it seemed. The USGS scientists and the University of Washington scientists studying the volcano were hopeful that if the volcano was going to erupt, it would have some major changes indicating it might be ready to erupt. Things like more violent explosions, or an increased rate of change in the bulge near Gort's Rock, or a sharp increase in earthquakes. Having precursors to the eruption would help them to get a warning out that something major was likely coming. If the bulge gave way first, it would cause the eruption, and there would be absolutely zero warning. So basically, they were hoping that they would have something to say, hey, listen, Harry Truman, this bulge is getting ready to go. We've had significantly more earthquakes. We've had significantly stronger eruptions. We have evidence of magma coming up out of the ground. Something that would say, hey, everyone who is in this area, Harry Truman, and other people trying to sneak in, this is bad. This is going to be bad. You need to stay out because this is going to happen. We don't have a day, but it should be here soon. But they just didn't have anything like that. It fell back into that steady state of 3.0 magnitude earthquakes, the occasional 4.0 magnitude, the phreatic eruptions of the old volcanic ash and the old volcanic rock mixing with the groundwater, a couple avalanches here and there, things like that. They didn't have anything really consistent to go on and say, hey, we know that this massive eruption is coming. You have got to be off the mountain. They just didn't have anything like that. Of course, with the reintroduction of explosions on the mountain, so too came the rumors of lava flowing and mass eruptions and all of the sorts, because that's another thing that came up with this, was there was a ton of various rumors of what was actually happening on the mountain, of lava flowing down, of the entire mountain has exploded, and all of these crazy things. And obviously, all of these were proven to be fake, but tied up time and resources for officials trying to monitor the mountain. You got to think, you have these actual eruptions happening at the mountain, and then you get a phone call that says, oh, I saw this massive lava flow on the south side of the mountain. Well, they know that nothing is really like they have avalanches and they'll have earthquakes and they'll have a couple, phreatic eruptions on the south side of the mountain, but nothing indicative of lava flow out of this mountain. And there wasn't really expected to be that kind of lava flow out of this mountain. But you still have to check, so that to send somebody up there, figure out who's going up there, send them up there, wait for them to get back, the whole 9 yards, in which they could be doing other things that are helpful instead of chasing things that are completely fake. Then, on May 15th, the eruptions abruptly stopped again and the mountain fell silent. This was the last straw for homeowners who lived in the red zone. They'd been forced to evacuate weeks prior and had not seen their homes or been able to grab any additional personal effects since then. So, they sent an ultimatum to authorities. At least let us in to pack things up, or we will storm the barricades in a giant mass and get in ourselves. Realizing that if a giant mass of people stormed the barricades, they did not have nearly enough people to A, stop them, and B, deal with getting them back out again and putting themselves in danger. So they decided, all right, we will counter this with sign a liability waiver and be out by nightfall. And this was agreed to. The first residents returned to their homes the morning of May 17th to collect and pack things to be out by nightfall on May 17th. On May 17th, it was David Johnston's turn to man Coldwater 2, the monitoring post set up 5 miles north of Mount Saint Helens. He arrived there in the morning and would stay there until the next morning, monitoring all of the equipment there and ensuring that everything was in working order. Nearby on May 17th, amateur radio operator Jerry Martin was driving his motorhome onto a ridge just north of where Coldwater 2 was located. He could literally see Coldwater 2 from where he was sitting. He was working on behalf of the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. If the volcano erupted, it was part of his job to make sure he radioed in to warn everyone of what had occurred. And any new eruptions, so any new phreatic eruptions, any new steam vents, any new avalanches, things like that, it was his job to report back to Vancouver of, hey, this is what's happening, this is what I can see from here. There was a whole system of people that were set up around the mountain whose job was to radio back any changes to the actual volcano itself. On the same morning, May 17th, an individual who was not at all supposed to be there decided it would be a good time to head up to the mountain. Robert Rogers, an individual local to the area, had spent the 2 months exploring the logging roads around Mount Saint Helens as the volcano spewed ash down all around. He dodged ash, scientists, and law enforcement to map the roads and climb up the mountain into the crater to get volcanic rocks and volcanic ash, which he dutifully brought back to scientists at Portland State University. The scientists super weren't asking where these samples were coming from, for good reason, and if anyone had asked them, they probably would have avoided the question as long as possible. But it was also 1980, so they just went along with plausible deniability. Rogers decided that the warm morning of May 17th was as good a day as any to get out and do some exploring and mapping of the red zone around Mount Saint Helens. Rogers began his journey up the mountainside that morning, not expecting to see much of anyone. Actively erupting volcano, entirely closed down mountainside that was a fairly steep find if you were caught, the usual things that would keep someone out of a mountain. Except, as he got close to the red zone after talking his way through a checkpoint, he stumbled upon a Ford Pinto parked on the side of the road. Curious who it could be, he stopped briefly and got out of his car to find them. Walking forward, he spotted them next to the road. It was a man in a U.S. Forestry Service uniform. Probably worst case scenario for him, honestly. He was likely busted. But this guy wasn't anywhere near a checkpoint. In fact, he wasn't by anything at all. He was on a forestry road in the middle of nowhere, which was odd. And in the back of his car, he saw an ice pick, which you would likely use to climb the mountain, which was extra odd. So Rogers took a gamble and asked the man if he was trying to climb the mountain. The man Rogers found was Francisco Valenzuela. He did in fact work for the U.S. Forestry Service, technically. His first day would be May 18th, 1980, as a recreation coordinator for the area that runs the forest around Mount Saint Helens. May 18th would be the next day. But he wanted to get up there the day before to explore the area. He wasn't supposed to be in the red zone, or at all, really, because he wasn't supposed to start work until the next day, and also recreation coordinators were not allowed in the red zone. So he was, taking a real big risk for a job that he was just starting, and he really just wanted to explore the area so that he would know what he was covering in his job, and I guess decided to risk his job if he was caught. So, realizing that the man that was now with him likely wasn't going to turn him in because he was also there, they decided to drive together further up the mountain to hike up to the crater. They got partway up before hitting the official start of the red zone, and also an area with no tree cover. They stashed the car in a grove of trees and began to walk. One thing Rogers noticed when they parked was a single orange tent on the opposite side of the Toutle River from where they were. It stuck out to him as odd because not many people should have been up there with just a tent, and again, it was an actively erupting volcano. Not long after starting on foot, Valenzuela became nervous because it was daytime and he was also directly violating the law while not having officially started his job yet that would have gotten him fired. And together they decided, maybe daytime on a bright sunny day where there's no tree cover and where people are actively watching this volcano expecting it to explode at any moment was a bad idea to hike up during. And so they decided to come back at 3 a.m., which is, a much better time to trespass. So they started to hike back down the mountain to their car. They then drove back to Goat Mountain, where they ran into two amateur radio operators, Ty and Mariana Kearney. They were doing the same work as Jerry Martin was. Basically, their job was to watch the mountain, see if anything changed, and if it did, to report it back to whoever was listening at the other end and tell them, hey, we have this new eruption here, we have this new fumarole here, we have this new avalanche here, or we have this new crack here, or the crater's getting bigger, or I can visibly see the massive bulge on the north side of the mountain moving. It was here that the two men decided to take their day and sleep near Ty and Mariana for some company. Now, they kept their distance a little bit, but they decided to bed down there for the night. Elsewhere on the mountain was a photographer by the name of Robert Landsberg. Now, he was a freelance photographer who had been on the mountain for the last several weeks, taking shots of the various stages of the event, and he was planning on selling them later. He was staying in an orange tent near the Toutle River on the mountain to take photographs up and down and all over the place. He would drive his green station wagon up and down the mountain to reach the spot where he was staying on the regular, and drove up the afternoon of May 17th in order to take photographs the next day. Now, later that night, May 17th, flights over the volcano recorded thermal imaging pictures. The imaging would not come in until later, but it showed significant amounts of hot spots appearing all around the edges of the bulge, showing magma pushing up from below and making the bulge significantly more unstable. Valenzuela and Rogers woke up at 3 a.m. on the morning of May 18th, 1980. They did so to keep under cover of darkness to make their trip up the mountain to go exploring a little bit easier to actually stomach because it's much harder to spot people in the middle of the night. Packing up quietly, they got in their car and drove up the mountain to the last outcropping of trees and stashed their car there. Then they began their ascent up the Sheep Canyon Trail. They hiked for a while before reaching another clearing. There, Valenzuela decided that it was 3 o'clock in the morning and he was tired and it was time for a nap, and Rogers hiked up to the timberline. Rogers would watch the sunrise over the volcano there. That was at about 5:30 a.m. At about 7 a.m., David Johnston, the volcanologist at Coldwater 2, radioed in his report for the morning to the USGS office in Vancouver of the laser measurements of the rapidly growing bulge on the volcano. He also reported clear skies and brisk conditions. Now, during their chat back between Vancouver and David, Vancouver voiced concern about David's safety on the mountain, and David also voiced his similar concerns back, that he was very concerned that the actual volcano was about to erupt, and they likely agreed and decided that something needed to be done about it. So, Vancouver contacted a local army base and arranged for an armored personnel carrier sent to the actual Coldwater 2 location to ferry, David back and forth when his area was over, and then whoever was up next to cover the mountain, it would take the armor personnel carrier would take them up, sit there with them, and then would take them back down. And they thought that maybe that would provide a little bit more safety to the person sitting on the mountain, just in case an eruption happened, and gave them a little bit way of maybe being able to make it out of the way in time. Back up to Valenzuela and Rogers. While snoozing on the log, Valenzuela was started awake by the volcano shaking. Suddenly remembering that he was currently taking a nap on a literally active volcano, he decided it was time to go. He got Rogers' attention, and they went back down to their car, and Rogers again noticed the orange tent. Except this time, there was a green station wagon parked next to it facing down the mountain. He also noticed a camera on a tripod, but he didn't see anyone else. Rogers considered going over to the tent and warning them that if the volcano did erupt, they were in a very bad place for it, but Valenzuela convinced him there was no time, and they booked it back down the volcano. Now, one of the things that would have been big concern is that where Landsberg was camped was kind of in a valley, and when a volcano erupts, a lot of those gases that come out are heavier than air. So, when it blows up and it comes down, those pyroclastic flows are naturally going to find their way into lower altitude areas. So valleys, places like that are going to it's going to hug the ground. And where his tent was located was in an actual valley near the Toutle River. So he would have been in a terrible place for, surviving, because again, all of that hot gas is going to hug the ground because all of that gas is naturally heavier than air, and he's likely going to asphyxiate if it comes directly at him. The two men, Valenzuela and Rogers, continued back to where they had camped for the night at about 8:20 a.m. and met back up with Ty and Mary Ann. Also that morning of May 18th, Harry Truman was in his lodge with his 16 cats, likely up for breakfast in the morning and getting ready for his day. Elsewhere on the mountain, about 10 miles from Mount Saint Helens, Jim Szymanski was out logging that morning with three coworkers, Ivlanti Sharapov, Leonte Skorohodov, and Jose Diaz. They were, out doing logging. They were all loggers, and they were taking the morning to maybe get some extra work done. Well, everybody but Jose. Jose was Catholic, and it was Sunday, and he refused to work on Sundays, so he was sitting up in the truck relaxing. Seems to me like he had the right idea. Not sure why he decided to go anyway, but hey, he was taking the morning off. Also that morning, two geologists out of Yakima, Washington, Keith and Dorothy Stoffel, chartered a flight to fly over the volcano and take pictures of what was going on. They were being flown by Bruce Judson around the volcano. Again, the flights over Mount Saint Helens did not stop even as we got further and further along. People still chartered flights to go get a glimpse of Mount Saint Helens as it was in its eruptive phase. Everything seemed to be normal to them, at least as normal as you could expect from a volcano that was constantly shaking and spewing out ash and steam. That was until 8:32 a.m., May 18th, 1980. Everything changed that very minute. David Johnston likely felt it first. Actually, Harry Truman likely felt it first. A massive 5.1 magnitude earthquake rocked the area. Almost instantaneously, hundreds of feet below them, the Stoffels saw the north face of the mountain begin to ripple and turn into what appeared to be liquid and then slide down the mountain. Immediately after that, about 30 seconds or so, a massive black cloud erupted from where the landslide was directly towards their plane. In that moment, when that earthquake struck and the north side of the volcano began to slide away, it was the largest landslide in recorded history. 2/3 of a cubic mile of material slid down the volcano, headed directly for Spirit Lake and the north side of the mountain. The landslide reached speeds of 120 miles per hour and was 540 feet thick in some areas. It covered a 23 square mile area when it was done. It was astronomically large. The landslide had broken the top on the magma, and the ensuing eruption was incredible. The explosion that occurred with the eruption is unlike many that have ever been witnessed by humans. The initial explosion left the volcano at approximately 220 miles per hour, but quickly sped up to 670 miles per hour or so. It was approximately 24 megatons of energy that was released in the explosion. To give you an idea of how much energy that is, imagine 500 Hiroshima atomic bombs. At the same time, the blast was so loud that it was heard hundreds of miles away in British Columbia, Idaho, Oregon, and Northern California. But that's where things become interesting. Because while the blast was incredibly loud, those within approximately 50 miles of the volcano heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. There was no boom. There was certainly a boom in cities further out, but an interaction between the air, the atmosphere, and some other things meant that those standing on the actual volcano themselves did not hear the explosion. Aside from the occasional breaking of trees and the smashing of rocks, there was no big boom for them. Some claimed to have heard a low rumble, some heard nothing at all. Some didn't even hear the trees breaking. They could see them breaking all around them, but they couldn't actually hear it. It's likely that David Johnston, being one of the closest to the actual volcano himself, felt the 5.1 magnitude earthquake, saw the north of the mountain give way, but never actually heard anything coming for him. He likely heard complete and utter silence. Harry Truman, same thing. Probably felt the earthquake. Probably felt the actual landslide coming at him, but never heard the eruption. And it's also possible that he was dead before the actual eruption occurred, because it took 30 to 45 seconds for the eruption to occur after the landslide started, and traveling at 120 miles an hour, it's going to get to his particular lodge very, very quickly. So he may never have actually experienced the eruption himself before his lodge was crushed by the landslide. Now, further out, climbers on Mount Adams reported seeing the giant explosion of black ash, but heard absolutely nothing before a heat wave hit them a few minutes later. So even as far out as Mount Adams, which is a good distance from Mount Saint Helens, they didn't actually hear the boom of the explosion. They saw it, they witnessed it, but there was no noise associated with it at all. They didn't hear anything. They didn't hear the landslide, they didn't hear the explosion, but they did feel a heat wave that traveled past them. And then a few minutes later, they felt a wind going back towards Mount Saint Helens from behind them back towards the mountain itself. Now, as soon as the eruption began, David grabbed his radio. He was sitting at Coldwater 2, just north of the mountain, had a perfect view of everything that was going on. It's very possible that he felt that magnitude 5.1 earthquake, looked up, saw the landslide give out, grabbed his radio, and into it he screamed, "Vancouver! Vancouver! This is it!" He then yelled something else into the radio, but it became mixed among radio static, and no one knows what it said. Almost immediately after this radio transmission went through, a pyroclastic flow overtook David's position, killing him instantly. Now, Vancouver never heard his message. It was recorded by another radio operator in the area. Eventually, several years later, his USGS trailer would be found. It was smashed to pieces and was found several miles from where he was located. His body was never found in the aftermath. David Johnston was the first American volcanologist to be killed by a volcano. A few miles north of him, Jerry Martin, remember him, he was the one that was operating the radio, was also on the radio giving updates about his position. I'm going to read you the full transcript of what would be his final moments. Now, we've got an eruption down here. Now we got a big slide coming off. The slide is coming off the west slope. Now we got a whole great big eruption out of the crater. And we got another opened up on the west side. The whole northwest side is sliding down. The whole north section is blowing up, coming up over the ridge towards me. I'm gonna back out of here. Gentlemen, the camper and car sitting over to the south of me is covered, and it's gonna get out me too. We can't get out of here. Jerry Martin was narrating the final moments of David Johnston's life as it covered the car and the camper south of him. And then he narrated his own final moments. He would be killed in the pyroclastic flow that overtook his camper. Meanwhile, up in the air, the pilot flying the Cessna carrying the Stoffels, Bruce Judson, had an issue. He knew that if that ash cloud reached the plane, they were either going to crash due to the ash clogging up the engine, or their plane was going to melt in the heat of the explosion, which was nearly 600 degrees Fahrenheit, and they were going to crash and die anyway. Either way, the ash cloud that was rapidly approaching him was very, very bad news. He needed to gain speed, and quickly, if they were going to live. So he threw the plane into a dive to gain speed, as he then rocketed towards the south away from all of that. Now I want you to imagine with me that you are in a plane that is flying over a volcano. For the last month and a half, this volcano has shot out some phreatic eruptions that were relatively small. It's had earthquakes. It's had steam that's come out. It hasn't really done much. There's been some avalanches, things like that. You pick the morning of May 18th because it's nice and sunny and clear. It's a great day to fly out and take some photos of this thing, see what is likely a once-in-a-lifetime experience of a volcano, be able to look down in the crater of an active volcano and think, hey, yeah, that's really cool. Nothing has happened to this point that would suggest that it has anything capable of this. And you're just the pilot. You're flying along. You've got these geologists in the back seat that are taking pictures and talking about this and that you can't understand. And then all of a sudden you look down and the ground below you has basically turned into liquid, and an area the size of a town has just fallen away from the volcano. And as you watch, all of a sudden there's this giant black cloud that shoots out of the volcano at unimaginable speeds directly at your plane. Your first thought is, I can't let that cloud get me or we will be dead. But to have the wherewithal that this man had was, I need to gain speed and I need to gain quickly. So he did the first thing he thought of and threw his plane straight down to pick up as much speed as possible to zoom away. You have to think, when you're the geologist sitting in the backseat, that this pilot has lost his mind. You just watched this mountain explode, and now my pilot is now free diving directly at the ground. You have to think that you're dead. There's no other explanation. This man has lost his mind. We are going down. This is our final moments. But Bruce Judson was an excellent pilot. He got them out of there. They survived. They were quite possibly the closest people to the actual eruption as anyone else, and they survived, all thanks to the quick thinking of their pilot. Up in the red zone near his campsite, Robert Landsberg lightly felt the earthquake and reached for his camera. We don't know much about his final moments, but we do know that in his final moments, Landsberg took several photos of the eruption headed directly for him. And what I'm telling you is that these are the best photographs of an eruption we probably have ever had, of at least a pyroclastic flow, because obviously we have very good photographs of Hawaiian eruptions and Icelandic eruptions because they're slow and you can get relatively close with a drone and things like that before the drone melts, but you still get good camera footage. These particular photographs are of a pyroclastic flow, a massive black cloud where you can see like little dots of gray and ash and whatnot headed directly at him. You can see the road leading away. You can see trees in the background and just this big black cloud of smoke headed directly at him. Now, he likely very quickly realized his position was a hopeless one. So he did the first thing he thought to do. A photographer through and through, he put his camera in his backpack, he put his backpack down, and he laid his body over the top of it in order to protect his camera and to be able to keep what he had taken photographs of for those to see in the future and for scientists to be able to study and to protect what he had been there to do. He was successful. Eventually, his body would be found 17 days later, buried in ash and rock near his station wagon, still covering his camera. He had successfully protected the pictures in his camera. They were developed and used in a National Geographic issue and remain some of the closest photos ever taken of a pyroclastic flow. And they are incredible. If you have not looked them up, I entirely recommend doing so. They're hard to tell. It's big and gray and black, but just being able to put yourself in the shoes of this man who has spent the last month taking photographs of this volcano that had a couple small eruptions here and there, earthquakes, things like that. Nothing like this would have been expected by him. He knew that these were his final moments. He knew he could not escape, and he decided to give his life to protect those photographs and to further the advancement of science, allowing scientists to study those photos, and he risked his life and he gave his life to protect it. Elsewhere, the 3 loggers that had gone out that morning had left Jose in the truck and headed down the hill to start cutting some trees. Not too much longer later, they felt a rumble. Then down the hill, Jose came screaming at them, "El volcán está explotando," which, for those of you that don't speak Spanish, and my accent is terrible, is the volcano is exploding in Spanish. Almost immediately after that, Jim heard an incredibly loud roar that sounded like several jet airliners, followed by a massive black cloud of super hot ash and gases. The cloud that hit them was so hot, Jim's gloves literally melted to his hands, and it became incredibly hard to see, breathe, or move. All 4 men took shelter briefly in their pickup truck before realizing they needed to get out of there. So they took off on foot together to try to walk to safety. It's likely that their truck wouldn't actually turn on because it had been choked out by ash. Sometime later, Sharapov broke off from the group to go a different way. In an apparent attempt to escape a mud flow, he climbed a tree. He would be found a few days later, dead in the tree from ash asphyxiation. Basically, so much ash went into his lungs, he suffocated to death. Jose Diaz would also split off from the group. He was found by a helicopter alive a few hours later, but would die of burns in the hospital. Leonte Skorohodov would also be rescued from the ash, but would die in the hospital from burns. Jim Skimanski would also be rescued by helicopter sometime later. He had burns over 40% of his body, but managed to survive. Harry Truman we talked about earlier, the man who refused to evacuate, the man who said if the volcano was going, it would take him with it, likely had 0 time to react to the volcano blowing itself open. Like I said earlier, he probably had no idea that the actual volcano had eruption. The landslide likely got to him first. He was immediately north of the volcano by only like a mile, maybe 2. His entire lodge was buried under several hundred feet of volcanic debris. The remains of the lodge have never been found. His remains have also never been found. They are likely buried in his lodge as well. He went out with the volcano. Back at the campsite with Ty and Marianne Kearney, Robert Rogers and Francisco Valenzuela, they heard the final words of Jerry Martin over the radio. Realizing quickly what was happening, all 4 decided it was very much time to leave. Ty and Marianne got in their vehicles and took off down the road. Rogers and Valenzuela got into their own respective vehicles and headed down the road. Now, driving down this road from where they were, they could only go towards the volcano because that was the only way the road went. Once they got to a certain point, there was a fork in the road. One way took them to safety, One way took them closer to the volcano. Rogers got there first. He panicked and couldn't remember which one was safety. He swerved to the right, and Valenzuela followed in his own Ford Pinto. The Kearneys, in their van, swerved to the left. Realizing the Kearneys took a different direction, Rogers slammed on his brakes thinking he made a mistake. Valenzuela had to swerve to avoid hitting Rogers and ended up stuck in the mud. He hopped out of his car and sprinted to Rogers. They then sped off down the road because Rogers was convinced that he had gone the right way before becoming disoriented in the smoke and the ash. They got out of their car, which seems like a choice, and hiked forward for a few miles before finding the South Fork of the Toutle River. This was not a good thing. This was where they had gone to go up on the volcano literally a few hours before, before the volcano had exploded. He could see the orange tint across the river. They had made a wrong turn. It was at this point that the wind shifted slightly and the men could see the volcano properly. The entire top chunk of the mountain was gone. In the course of about 45 seconds, Mount Saint Helens had gone from the 5th tallest peak in Washington to the 30th tallest peak in Washington. They decided to go back to Rogers' car, drove back to Valenzuela's car, and managed to pull it from the mud, then headed back the way they came. Rogers realized at some point that he had lost his film to his camera and resolved to go back to where they had camped to find it. This was heavily protested against by Valenzuela, but Rogers would not be convinced otherwise, so they drove back to the campground. There, Rogers managed to spot the bright yellow canister on the ground, and without slowing his car, he pulled up to the campsite, opened his car door, and snagged the canister off the ground before turning around and going left at the fork instead of right. But the problem became they couldn't actually see anything anymore. The ash cloud had completely blocked out the sunlight. They passed a yellow excavator that he knew was on the way back to Cougar where they were headed, and they kept driving that way. And then, a few minutes later, they passed the yellow excavator again, except it was the same yellow excavator they had already passed. Both men realized separately in separate cars that they were driving in circles. So, they decided to just stay where they were and wait and see what happened, if the volcano would take them or if they would survive. It's likely that they realized driving into this was possibly signing them up to get lost and wander until they were out of gas or fall into a mud flow or something of that nature. So they waited for a while in their cars before the ash cloud finally broke and they could see again, kind of. But they decided not to leave yet. Realizing this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, Rogers decided to stay and take photographs. Valenzuela made them both sandwiches of lettuce, tomato, cheese, and volcanic ash, because everything in the area had volcanic ash in it at this point. The two men then got in their vehicles and drove off the mountains. It was still Valenzuela's first day at work after all, and he really needed to report to work. I'm not sure how he was going to explain all the ash, but, it is what it is. Francisco Valenzuela would continue his career with the U.S. Forestry Service and would later get married and have a daughter. He named his daughter Tefra after the scientific name of ash that nearly trapped him on Mount Saint Helens all those years ago. Robert Rogers would continue to make secret trips up to Mount Saint Helens in the days and months after the eruption. Years later, he would get married and also have a daughter. He also gave his daughter the middle name of Tefra, completely unaware that the man he nearly lost his life with all those years ago, trespassing on Mount Saint Helens on the day it exploded, had done the same thing. In the end, 57 individuals within about 20 miles of Mount St. Helens would die in a landslide, eruption, and subsequent mud flows and lahars. Well, maybe 57 people died. The number is slightly in dispute. Only 36 bodies were found in the remains. 21 people are missing and presumed dead, include both Harry Truman and David Johnston. There are 2 individuals, however, who were reported missing in the aftermath of the volcano that are still a mystery. In the immediate 24 hours after the eruption, Red Cross volunteers received 3,400 phone calls reporting at least that many people missing. When they received a phone call, the name went on a note card with whatever information they received in the call. One of those people is Doug Thayer. He was reported missing by someone named Mrs. Al Canharn of Clatskanie. She said that he was possibly fishing on the Toutle River and he was from Olympia. That was literally it. The other missing name was Paul Hyatt. The person who left his name gave even less information. They literally just gave his name and that he was somewhere around Toutle. Because there was so little information on either man, no search party was ever sent to find them. They had a lot to work to do based on finding people they had actual information on, and they couldn't really spend time chasing phantoms. There's reports that the two men by the names were actually found alive after the eruption, but they couldn't figure out if they were the same Paul Hyatt and Doug Thayer. To make matters even more confusing, the lady who reported Doug Thayer missing was tracked down and says she didn't actually report him missing. In addition, those two were the only two reported victims of Mount Saint Helens that did not have a death certificate requested, which either means no one cared enough to follow up to settle the affairs, or they didn't actually die. It's likely one of those mysteries that will never be solved. There was also two other bodies that were found in the aftermath of the Mount Saint Helens eruption that were dead before the actual eruption. Two girls had been shot in the woods near Mount Saint Helens and left prior to the actual eruption, and they were found in the aftermath covered in volcanic ash, were originally thought to be victims of the eruption, but were actually, unfortunately, murdered beforehand. Now, most people that died in the eruption died of asphyxiation, usually ash asphyxiation. Basically, they became trapped in a pyroclastic flow or a flow of ash or something of that nature, and in an attempt to get out, they breathed in so much ash that their lungs could no longer properly give them oxygen, and they suffocated to death and died. Now, many of them likely died almost immediately because they were so overcome that it killed them, and it was very quick, especially people like David Johnston and Harry Truman and others that were actually near the volcano, because there were several people that were around the volcano that were fishing and doing other camping. There were several children that were out with their parents camping around Mount St. Helens, which seems like an interesting choice to make with your child. There was one child that was 7 years old, 8 years old. There were a couple teenagers that were out with their parents, things like that. So that was a lot of the actual victims of the eruption. They died of asphyxiation. A couple of them died of burns. Those that were out logging died of burns that they received from being in one of the pyroclastic flows, things like that. So, when the 5.1 magnitude earthquake occurred, it finally released that bulge that had been building up on the north end of the mountain for the last month or so. The earthquake lasted approximately 2 to 3 seconds before the bulge on the mountainside began to ripple up and down, then released at the top and began sliding north. Now, this particular landslide broke off in 3 different sections that then cascaded down the mountain. This was the largest landslide in recorded history. 2/3 of a cubic mile of material moved down the side of the mountain and wiped out everything in its path. The landslide would travel a full 15.5 miles away from the mountain and cover 23 square miles. Anywhere from 5 to 15 seconds after the landslide began, the explosion occurred behind it and rocketed a massive plume of ash directly north out the side of the mountain, which instantly obliterated approximately 1,400 feet of the top of the volcano. So Mount Saint Helens was a Plinian eruption that was a lateral eruption. Because of where that landslide occurred, that Plinian eruption was able to go out the side of the mountain rather than the top, as we are used to seeing with volcanoes. It was a VEI of 5, and it was hugely, hugely destructive. The area directly in front of the volcano on this north side, where that lateral eruption came out, for about 8 miles is called the direct blast zone. Everything in this area was annihilated. Nothing was left. All trees, all life, everything was gone. There was nowhere to hide. The only place you could hide was underground. It wasn't like you could hide on the far side of a hill and hope it spilled over you while you were in the valley, or because volcanic gases are generally heavier than air, you could get higher and be safe. No, not in the direct blast zone. You anywhere you were, unless you were underground, you were dead. That's the end of it. Every single thing was gone, completely wiped away. Every single plant and tree in approximately 230 square mile area north of the volcano was completely obliterated, wiped off the face of the planet by a combination of the landslide and then a massive black cloud of just superheated gases, ash, and volcanic rock from a pyroclastic flows. There were also pyroclastic flows that went down the east, west, and south sides of the mountain. If you were in these three quadrants, you had a much better chance of survival. So let's say you're on a hill and manage to avoid the mud flows and the pyroclastic flows. You're just hit by a big cloud of ash. You have beaten the odds so far, but you get a new fun thing to worry about. You see, during volcanic eruptions, like I talked earlier, the pieces of ash and rock and all of that bump and collide in the massive explosion and create friction. That friction builds up and eventually creates lightning. Eyewitness accounts from the other side of the mountains and the survivors in that area say that the lightning was constant and they witnessed it striking trees and starting wildfires. And in one case, there was an individual who witnessed one of the lightning strikes actually strike a person. Now, back on the north side, after the direct blast zone was the channelized blast zone that stretched about 19 miles from the volcano. This one was channelized because while most trees were completely obliterated, some of them were able to survive thanks to some of the pyroclastic flows and mud flows tending to stick to valleys rather than just being forced up and over everything by sheer force of what's coming out of the mountain. Around 45 seconds after the landslide began, which remember is separate from the eruption, it was overtaken by the actual eruption cloud, which if you think about is wildly terrifying. This giant mass of Earth has turned into a rapidly moving giant wall of death that is being chased down and overtaken by a superheated black cloud of ash and rock and whatever else that incinerates instantly anything it overtakes. So let's just imagine you just happen to be on top of this giant landslide. Let's say you're on top of that bulge for whatever weird reason you can think of, and you happen to find the one space on this now what it feels like liquid piece of landslide, and you are riding it out. Let's say you're Rose on the door of the Titanic, riding out this particular landslide on top of it, moving away from the volcano. You're already terrified because again, a 1 point however big square mile area of land has just instantly moved away and is moving at 120 miles an hour. You have a brief moment to think, hey, maybe I can survive this. Maybe I can surf this landslide out and make it out of this alive. And then the next second, you are overtaken by 600-degree cloud and instantly cooked alive as the eruption behind you that you cannot hear overtakes you and kills you instantly. And to make matters worse, not only can you not hear it, you likely don't feel it. Most witnesses reported that there was no pressure wave with this particular explosion. The most people reported feeling was their ears popped numerous times or like they were being squeezed all over. Not even a hard squeeze, just a little bit of a squeeze. So there likely was some kind of pressure wave, but if you're on top of a landslide, you're probably not paying attention to that, and then you're instantly just dead. You had a brief, 30 seconds of, hey, I might actually survive this, and then you're cooked alive. And then there was some reporting that there was a heat wave moving away from the volcano, and then just a few minutes after that, or a few seconds after that, there was a wind moving back towards the volcano. Now, this is similar to the stack effect we talked about with Grenfell Tower, except on a grand scale. The eruption would have created a low pressure area at the top of the volcano by, exploding and pushing everything away. So this explosion on top of this volcano was so large. You have this mass of air. You have this explosion that occurs and it forces everything outward. Now you've created a space where there is no there's very little air left. Once you have that wave that goes out, that initial heat wave that goes out and pushes things out, you have to backfill that low pressure area. So you get that wind pulling back in that was likely felt on a grand scale in Mount St. Helens. And it's also possible that there was a little bit of a pressure wave. It's likely people felt wind, but that wind was combined with the pyroclastic flows that automatically felt like being hit by wind, so they weren't really able to differentiate between the two. It's likely that there was some form of pressure wave going out because they did report that wind going back towards the volcano. So that's just one of those interesting things that you don't really think about in the aftermath of, especially an explosion, because with all explosions, you get that negative pressure wave. If you have an explosion inside a house, one of the things that you can look for is, so when you have your explosion, it goes out and then it comes back in. If you look at, say, a window of a house that's been exploded, you will find glass in both the inside of the building and the outside. You won't find much glass on the inside, but you will find some because that explosion comes out, and then any glass that's left in the actual window frame that wasn't blown out by the explosion will get sucked back in by that negative pressure wave coming in back in. That happened at a grand, hugely huge scale with Mount St. Helens, is that it pushed everything out and then it sucked it back in. And it's likely that people didn't really notice because, well, they were worried about other things at the time. Now, approximately 10 minutes after the initial lateral blast to the north of the mountain towards Spirit Lakes, a Plinian eruption column then began going straight up nearly 12 miles into the atmosphere. Numerous commercial airline pilots who were flying around the area witnessed the eruption go up and spread laterally at about 60,000 feet. As it began to spread, bits of rock and ash began to fall out of the sky, and a commercial pilot actively complained over the radio of being hit by rocks as he flew under the ash cloud. Back on the ground, mud flows from the volcano began pouring into rivers. You see, everything that erupted out of the volcano was so hot, it melted all the glaciers and snowpack on Mount St. Helens that had not already melted. The combination of melting glaciers, melting snow, groundwater, and tephra falling from the sky created what is called a lahar, or volcanic mudflow, that traveled at nearly 90 miles per hour closer to the volcano and smashed into both the North and South Fork Toutle rivers. These mudslides then traveled down the river valleys and crushed anything and everything in their way. By 90 minutes after the eruption, one of the mudflows on the north fork of the Toutle River had moved nearly 30 miles upstream and was nearly 12 feet high as it passed by and put the river at a record high flood stage. Several locations of this particular mudflow had depths of 30 to 70 feet deep, and there was some evidence that early on the mudflows went over the top of hills that were nearly 250 feet tall. The other thing with these mudflows is they were hot. Even by the time they had traveled 20 or 30 miles and mixed with the waters of multiple rivers and had plenty of time to release some of that heat, they were still nearly 90 degrees in temperature, which indicates that as they started to form during the initial eruption and moments afterwards, they were incredibly hot. Eventually, the mudflow on the North Toutle River entered the Cowlitz River, which had its water capacity reduced by 85%. And after that, it entered the Columbia River. Now, this was a major issue because of a lot of the sediment dumped in the Columbia and settled there. The Columbia River Navigational Channel is a major thoroughfare for ocean shipping in Portland, Oregon. All this settlement settling at the bottom of the river reduced the river depth from 39 feet to 13 feet. It was about 30 million cubic meters of material that was deposited in the river. No major ocean ships were going to be able to travel that area until it was dredged and cost Portland somewhere around $5 million in lost shipping in 1980. This particular mudflow, the one on the North Fork of the Toutle River, destroyed several bridge crossings as well on the Toutle River as well as on the Cowlitz River. In total, between the landslide, explosion, mudflows, and all of that, nearly 200 miles worth of road, 15 miles of railway, 43 bridges, and 200 homes were completely destroyed. The Washington State Department of Game estimated that nearly 7,000 elk, deer, and bear died in the eruption, as well as untold numbers of birds and small mammals. And then came the ashfall. All that tephra being shot into the atmosphere had to go somewhere. It'll hit the stratosphere, then spread out before falling back down to the ground because obviously it's heavier than air. This was both a good and bad thing. For places nearer to Mount Saint Helens, the ash would significantly hamper growth of crops in the area. But for those areas out in eastern Washington, the ash in the atmosphere helped to condense water, which created a higher than normal rainfall, and the production of crops was significantly higher in 1980 than any other year. The ash also helps to retain water in the ground for dry summer months because it creates kind of a crust, and then the water is able to sit in the ground better and doesn't evaporate as fast. And then, the ash, as it breaks down, also puts helpful chemicals into the ground to help create more fertile soil. The particular ash column that shot out of Mount St. Helens was fed for 9 hours after the eruption, and it spread ash everywhere. In the short term, the ash falling from the sky caused major problems throughout Washington and Oregon. Roads had to be shut down because drivers couldn't see. Interstate 90 from Seattle to Spokane was closed for a week because of the ash. In some places, it was so thick on the roadway you couldn't actually drive. The ash also got into everything. It clogged internal combustion engines, it clogged water treatment plants, it clogged air conditioning units, and all of it had to be removed and cleaned, otherwise it would not work. Commercial flights were canceled all over eastern Washington because there was so much ash on the runways and no one could see. It took weeks to clear all the ash from roadways and parking lots and runways. Many millions of pounds of ash was everywhere, and it wasn't just Washington. Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma all reported ash falling from the sky. It covered at least a 22,000 square mile area. Finer ash particles from the eruption that were able to stay aloft longer spread all the way around the globe within about a week to 2 weeks. The actual eruption took Mount St. Helens from the 5th tallest mountain in Washington to the 30th. It was 9,677 feet tall before the eruption. Now, with the lateral eruption taking out a huge chunk of the volcano, it was only 8,365 feet. Now, eruptions would continue off and on at Mount St. Helens for the next several weeks with various velocities. An eruption on May 25th would send an ash column nearly 9 miles into the atmosphere and would trap a film crew that had been flown up on the mountain for a few days. Their compasses spun in circles, and the maps they brought were useless because the volcano had just been blown away and it had destroyed much of the landscape that they would actually use to find their way around using those maps. They quickly became disoriented in the falling ash and wandered around trying to find a way out. They had only brought 1 day worth of food. Eventually, they were rescued via helicopter after 5 days on the volcano. The total estimated cost of the disaster was around $1.1 billion in damage in 1980, which is about $4.1 billion today. But the true cost is difficult to calculate as damage is still occurring to this day. Just last year, a landslide involving material ejected from the volcano in 1980 washed out a bridge near Mount Saint Helens. Outside of the observable damage and the lives lost, the state of Washington lost a considerable amount of tourism in the aftermath of Mount St. Helens, and the towns around the volcano had an incredibly high unemployment rate. But fortunately, both of those recovered massively not long after because seeing the catastrophic damage was very interesting for people in the area, and recovery efforts to remove debris skyrocketed the number of jobs available. Now, the actual area around Mount St. Helens is a massive tourist attraction now. There are a ton of people that go and visit the mountain now to go see the remains of whatever is left. And a lot of it has grown back. Don't get me wrong, like a lot of Mount St. Helens is green, but the actual crater area and that landslide just north of it heading towards Spirit Lake is still a desolate land. Nothing grows there. And in Spirit Lake as well, there are still trees floating that were destroyed in the actual eruption. There's a whole huge chunk on the south end of Spirit Lake that is full of the trunks of trees that were blown into the lake during the eruption. And a lot of the area is based on that. Like, they renamed some of the ridges after Harry Truman. They renamed one of the ridge where Coldwater 2 was, they renamed it after David Johnston. There were significant advances in volcanology as a result of Mount St. Helens that are still being used to this day. Actually, so David Johnston was the first American volcanologist to be killed in an actual volcanic eruption. But one of the individuals that was there with David Johnston, who David Johnston was teaching, would actually be the second American volcanologist to be killed by an eruption, and he was killed in a pyroclastic flow in the 90s. And just looking at Mount St. Helens and the aftermath, it is wild to look at a before photo of Mount St. Helens and an after photo of Mount St. Helens, because it is not an exaggeration. The entire side of the mountain was obliterated, and you can see the tracks of it as it blew down the mountainside. It is one of the wildest things to have ever seen. Just the sheer awesome power of this volcano and the earth just obliterating this thing that is the size of a small town and making it so that it no longer exists, and everything around it has been completely destroyed. And it's also crazy to look at how quickly the actual habitats of these particular places grew back, because anything that was below ground mostly survived. Seeds that were below ground, sprouts that were getting ready to come up, mostly survived. Mammals that lived below ground survived if they were a good distance outside. Some of the ones that were closer likely perished because they couldn't, dig back up through all of the volcanic deposit. But even then, it still grew on a lot of the landslide, and all of that ash helped to further diversify the landscape around Mount St. Helens, and has made it so that we have a better understanding of A, how our planet reacts to volcanoes, and B, how we can deal with volcanic ash and how we can bring our communities back when something like this happens. It's one of those things where it wasn't a thing that we could have stopped. It wasn't a thing that we could have done anything to be better prepared for. It's just one of those things that happen, and we have to learn how to understand it, see the signs in the future, and be able to tell, specifically when this particular eruption is going to occur, when the next eruption might occur, where the next eruption might occur, what signs we learned from Mount St. Helens of, oh, this is going to explode here, this is going to explode here. This gave us so much information, and so much good came out of it to better help us as a human species to understand this particular incident. And so, with that, we've reached the end of yet another episode of Disastrous History. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, you can follow me on all social media. It's Disastrous History everywhere. I appreciate you all so much. Hopefully my next episode will not take me as long to write. This one was 13,500 words. Hopefully the next one will not be nearly as long, and we will be able to meet back together. If you prefer, this particular episode is going to be up on YouTube. You can actually see me talking. If you want to, I'm going to try and include photos of particular things we talked about in the episode in the actual video, so you'll get a photographic idea of what is going on, especially of like David Johnston's photos and the before and after photos of the mountain and pictures of the seismographs and things like that, as what I hope to do. So, if that's your thing, if you're still here listening and you haven't given up because this was a 2-hour and 15-minute long episode, then I appreciate you. As always, remember to check your smoke detector batteries and stay safe.